She promised she'd be there for every appointment, but when the oncologist said the word stage 3, I watched my daughter gather her purse and whisper something about an important meeting. That was the moment I knew I was fighting this battle alone, and it was also the moment I decided she would inherit exactly what she gave me, nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lucille Parker, though everyone has called me Lucy since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. At 71 years old, I thought I had seen every shade of disappointment life could paint, but nothing prepared me for the particular kind of abandonment that comes wrapped in medical gowns and sterile waiting rooms. I had raised 3 children. As a single mother after my husband Richard died in a construction accident when I was 38. Emma, my eldest, was always the golden child, the one who excelled at everything she touched. She graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, landed a prestigious job at a marketing firm in Chicago, married a successful attorney, and lived in one of those sprawling suburban houses with perfectly manicured lawns and security systems that cost more than I made in 6 months. For 47 years, I had been the kind of mother who dropped everything when any of my children called. When Emma's marriage hit a rough patch 5 years ago, I drove 8 hours through a snowstorm to watch her twins so she could attend couples therapy. When her promotion required late nights and weekend work, I became the default babysitter, grandmother, and emotional support system. I reorganized my entire retirement around her schedule, postponing the pottery classes I had dreamed of taking, canceling the European river cruise I had saved for since Richard died, all because Emma needed me to be available. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had built her entire identity around being needed would find herself desperately needing someone else just when it mattered most. I had always been the rock, the foundation, the one who held everything together while everyone else pursued their dreams and ambitions. I cooked holiday dinners for 20 people every year, remembered every birthday and anniversary, sent care packages to my son David when he was deployed overseas, and helped my youngest, Michael, through his struggles with addiction. I was the family glue, and I had worn that role like a badge of honor for decades. The symptoms started subtly, the way these things often do. A persistent cough I blamed on the changing seasons, fatigue I attributed to getting older, a nagging pain in my chest that I convinced myself was heartburn from too much coffee. I had always been healthy, rarely visiting doctors except for routine checkups, so when the symptoms persisted through 3 months of home remedies and over-the-counter medications, I finally made an appointment with Dr. Peterson, my family physician for the past 15 years. He was a kind man with gentle hands and wire-rimmed glasses that always seemed to sit slightly crooked on his nose. When he listened to my chest that Tuesday morning in October, his expression shifted in a way that made my stomach drop. He ordered a chest X-ray, then a CT scan, then referred me to an oncologist with the kind of urgency that makes your hands shake and your mind race to places you don't want it to go. Dr. Sarah Chen was the oncologist, a brilliant woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a direct manner that I appreciated. She didn't dance around the diagnosis or try to soften the blow with medical jargon I wouldn't understand. She sat across from me in her office, surrounded by diplomas and medical journals, and told me I had non-small cell lung cancer that had spread to my lymph nodes. Stage 3, she said, which meant it was serious but not hopeless. Treatment would be aggressive, chemotherapy, radiation, possibly surgery depending on how my body responded. I remember staring at the anatomical poster on her wall, a detailed illustration of human lungs that suddenly seemed both fascinating and terrifying. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, like the walls were slowly closing in. Dr. Chen was explaining treatment protocols and survival statistics, but all I could think about was how I was going to tell my children that they're invincible. Mother had suddenly become very, very mortal. I called Emma first, naturally. She had always been my closest confidant, the one I turned to when I needed someone to help me process difficult news. Her voice was bright and rushed when she answered, the sound of keyboard clicking in the background. I could picture her in her corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and modern furniture, multitasking while we talked the way she always did. When I told her about the diagnosis, the clicking stopped. There was a moment of silence that stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then she started asking practical questions in her efficient, problem-solving voice. What stage was it? What were the treatment options? Had I gotten a second opinion? She sounded like she was taking notes, organizing my cancer into neat categories she could manage and control. She promised she would rearrange her schedule to come with me to the next appointment. She would research the best treatment centers, find the top specialists, make sure I had everything I needed. For a moment, listening to her take charge with the same competence she brought to everything else, I felt a wave of relief. I wasn't going to face this alone. My daughter, my successful, capable daughter, would be my advocate and companion through whatever lay ahead. That relief lasted exactly 2 weeks. The first appointment she missed was with the genetic counselor. Emma called 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet, her voice tight with stress, explaining that a major client was threatening to pull their account and she couldn't leave the office. These things happen, I told myself. Work emergencies come up, especially in high-pressure jobs like hers. I rescheduled the appointment and went alone, sitting in the waiting room watching other patients with their family members, feeling conspicuous in my solitude. The second missed appointment was with the radiation oncologist. This time, her twin daughter Sophia had a soccer tournament that Emma couldn't miss. As team mom, she explained, she had responsibilities to the other families. I understood, or tried to. Being a grandmother meant sometimes putting grandchildren's needs first. I took notes during the appointment, trying to remember all the questions Emma had helped me prepare, wishing I had someone to help me process the complex information about radiation schedules and side effects. By the third missed appointment, a pattern was emerging that I couldn't ignore anymore. There was always something more pressing, more immediate, more important than sitting in sterile medical offices with her sick mother. A work crisis, a school event, a social obligation, a family emergency that somehow never included my emergency. Each cancellation came with elaborate apologies and promises to make it up to me, but the promises felt increasingly hollow. The most painful part wasn't the practical inconvenience of navigating cancer treatment alone. It was the growing realization that after 47 years of being available for everyone else, no one seemed available for me when I needed it most. I had spent decades believing that love was measured in sacrifice, that being a good mother meant putting everyone else's needs before my own. I had convinced myself that this generosity would be reciprocated when the time came, that the foundation of care I had built would support me when I needed it. Instead, I found myself sitting alone in waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and despair, surrounded by other patients who had family members holding their hands and asking questions I wished someone would ask for me. I watched daughters helping their mothers fill out medical forms, sons driving their fathers to treatment, spouses sitting together in quiet solidarity through the long hours of chemotherapy infusions. The contrast between their support systems and my isolation was stark and heartbreaking. I started keeping a journal during those early weeks of treatment, writing down my thoughts and observations in a small leather notebook I carried in my purse. It helped me process the overwhelming amount of medical information and gave me something to do during the long waits between appointments. I wrote about the side effects of chemotherapy, the way my hair started falling out in clumps, the metallic taste that made even my favorite foods unappetizing. But mostly, I wrote about the loneliness. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being sick. It's not just the physical discomfort or the fear of what might happen. It's the isolation that comes when your world shrinks to the size of a hospital room and the people you thought would be there to hold that world together are nowhere to be found. You realize how much of your identity was built around being strong for others, and when you can no longer be strong, you discover who will be strong for you. The answer, in my case, was no one. My son David called regularly from his base in North Carolina, but he was dealing with his own challenges as a single father since his divorce. Michael visited when he could, but his work as a traveling nurse kept him on the road most weeks. They both offered to help in whatever ways they could from a distance, but neither could provide the day-to-day support I needed. That responsibility fell to Emma, the daughter who lived 20 minutes away and had promised to be my primary caregiver. The excuses became more creative as the weeks went on. She had to attend a mandatory work retreat the week I started radiation. Her husband had a conference the day of my oncology appointment. One of the twins was sick the morning I needed someone to drive me home after a particularly difficult chemotherapy session. Each explanation was reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of priorities that placed my health somewhere near the bottom of her list. I started taking taxis to my appointments, something that felt both practical and deeply symbolic. There's something humbling about climbing into a stranger's car to go receive cancer treatment, making small talk with a driver who doesn't know that this routine trip to the medical center represents the most frightening experience of your life. The taxi drivers were kind, most of them, but their kindness only highlighted the absence of the people who should have been caring for me. The worst day came in November, 3 months into my treatment. I had what Dr. Chen called a rough reaction to a new chemotherapy drug combination. The nausea was overwhelming, unlike anything I had experienced before. I couldn't keep food down for 2 days, became severely dehydrated, and ended up in the emergency room at 3 in the morning when my neighbor found me collapsed on my kitchen floor. I called Emma from my hospital bed, my voice weak and shaky from the 4 medications they had given me. I told her where I was, what had happened, how scared I felt lying there alone in the sterile hospital room with machines beeping around me. She listened with what sounded like genuine concern, promised she would come right away, assured me that everything would be okay. She arrived 6 hours later, rushing in with coffee stains on her blouse and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked harried and stressed, checking her phone every few minutes while I tried to explain what the doctors had told me about adjusting my medication dosage. When her phone rang 40 minutes into her visit, she stepped into the hallway to take the call. I could hear her voice through the thin walls, animated and engaged in a way it hadn't been while talking to me. When she came back, she looked apologetic but distracted. There was a crisis at work, she explained. A major presentation had gone wrong, and she needed to get back to the office to help fix the situation. She would check on me later, she promised. She would call the hospital to get updates. She kissed my forehead and left me lying there, wondering when I had become less important than a PowerPoint presentation. That night, alone in my hospital room, I made a decision that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I reached for my phone and called my attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Williams who had handled my estate planning for the past decade. I told her I needed to schedule an appointment to revise my will. When she asked if there was any particular urgency, I looked around the empty room and said yes, there was. The next morning, Emma arrived with flowers and an elaborate breakfast from my favorite cafe. She had cleared her entire day, she announced, to spend time with me and help me get settled at home. She fussed over my pillows, adjusted the television volume, and chatted brightly about her work and the twins' latest adventures. But her attention felt performative, like she was playing the role of a devoted daughter rather than actually being one. I watched her bustling around my hospital room, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness or fear. I felt clarity. This burst of attention wasn't about my needs, it was about her guilt. She was trying to make up for her absence with a single day of intensive caregiving, as if compassion could be concentrated and administered in large doses to compensate for its chronic absence. When Dr. Chen made her rounds that afternoon, Emma asked intelligent questions and took detailed notes. She discussed treatment protocols and side effects with the kind of focused attention she brought to her business meetings. But I noticed that she directed most of her questions to the doctor rather than including me in the conversation. I had become a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Emma had shifted into her professional mode, treating my illness like a project that needed efficient handling. She created schedules and organized my medications with the same competence she brought to managing marketing campaigns. It was impressive and completely hollow at the same time. Over the following weeks, her visits became predictable and strategic. She would arrive with specific agendas, organizing my pill dispenser, meal planning for the week, updating my insurance information. She approached my cancer like a logistics challenge, solving problems with impressive efficiency while somehow missing the emotional core of what I was experiencing. I realized that she couldn't see me anymore. She saw an aging mother who needed management, a responsibility that interfered with her real life, a problem that required the minimum amount of attention necessary to maintain her image as a dutiful daughter. The woman who had once been my closest confidant had become a stranger who performed the motions of care without understanding its essence. The final straw came in December, during what should have been one of the most important appointments of my treatment journey. Dr. Chen had scheduled a comprehensive evaluation to determine how well I was responding to the chemotherapy and whether surgery might be an option. It was the kind of appointment that could reshape my entire prognosis, the difference between hope and hospice care. Emma had confirmed 3 times that she would be there. She had marked it on her calendar, rearranged 2 meetings, and assured me that nothing would interfere with this crucial appointment. I felt a flutter of the old trust, the belief that when it really mattered, my daughter would show up for me. I arrived at Dr. Chen's office 30 minutes early, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still. I had prepared a list of questions, researched new treatment options, and spent the previous night visualizing positive outcomes. This was going to be the turning point, the moment when months of suffering would be justified by good news about my recovery. 15 minutes before the appointment, Emma texted. Her daughter had fallen off her bike and might need stitches. She was at urgent care and couldn't leave. Could I reschedule? I stared at my phone, reading the message 3 times before the words fully registered. Could I reschedule? As if cancer operated on my convenience, as if oncologists were available for last-minute appointments, as if my health was something that could be postponed for a scraped knee. I walked into Dr. Chen's office alone, my hands shaking with something that felt like grief. The news was good, better than we had hoped. The tumors had shrunk significantly, and I was a candidate for surgery that could potentially cure me completely. Dr. Chen smiled as she explained the treatment plan, her optimism infectious despite my emotional numbness. I should have been celebrating. Instead, I sat in her office taking notes with tears streaming down my face, not from joy but from the profound sadness of having no one to share this miracle with. The woman who had given me life was being offered a second chance at living. And my daughter was too busy managing a minor childhood injury to witness the moment. That evening, I called Patricia Williams and scheduled the appointment to revise my will. When Emma finally called to check on the appointment results, I gave her the medical updates in a calm, detached voice. She was thrilled about the surgery option, full of enthusiasm and relief that felt both genuine and utterly beside the point. As I listened to her celebrate news she hadn't been present to receive, I felt something inside me shift permanently. This wasn't about one missed appointment or even a pattern of missed appointments. This was about fundamental values, about what we prioritize when life forces us to choose, about the difference between loving someone and actually caring for them. I realized that Emma loved the idea of me, the concept of having a devoted mother who would always be there for her. But she had no capacity for loving the reality of me, the actual person who was frightened and sick and needed someone to hold her hand through the most terrifying experience of her life. She wanted the benefits of having a family without the responsibilities that family required. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and my leather journal, writing down my thoughts about love and disappointment and the price of always being available for people who are never available in return. I wrote about the difference between being needed and being valued, about how exhausting it was to love people more than they loved you back. I thought about my own mother, who had died when I was 53, and how I had never missed a single one of her medical appointments during her battle with heart disease. I had taken vacation days from work, arranged childcare, and sat beside her through endless hours of waiting and worrying. It had never occurred to me that there was any other choice, that my presence was optional or that my work obligations trumped her health needs. The revelation was painful but liberating. I had spent 47 years believing that unconditional love meant unconditional availability, that being a good mother required sacrificing my own needs for my children's comfort. I had taught my daughter, through decades of example, that my time and energy were infinitely renewable resources that she could access without consideration or reciprocity. But cancer had given me a different perspective on time and energy. When your mortality becomes visible, when each day carries the weight of uncertainty, you start measuring everything differently. You realize that your presence is a gift, not an obligation, and that gift should be cherished by those who receive it. Emma had treated my presence like a utility service, something that would always be available when she needed it but could be ignored when she didn't. She had never learned to value what was freely given because it had always been free. My unconditional love had enabled her conditional care, and the imbalance had become so normalized that she couldn't even see it anymore. The surgery was scheduled for January 15th, exactly 2 weeks after my 72nd birthday. It would be a complex procedure, Dr. Chen explained, requiring a skilled surgical team and several hours in the operating room. The recovery would be extensive, involving weeks of limited mobility and careful monitoring. Success wasn't guaranteed, but it offered the best chance for a complete cure. When I told Emma about the surgery date, she immediately began organizing her schedule around it. She would take the entire week off work, she announced. She would stay at my house during recovery, handle all my medications, and make sure I followed the doctor's orders precisely. Her efficiency was impressive, her planning thorough, her commitment seemingly absolute. But I had learned not to trust her commitments anymore. Her promises had become meaningless, elaborate performances designed to ease her guilt rather than address my needs. I listened to her detailed plans with the detached interest of someone watching a movie, curious about the plot but not emotionally invested in the outcome. I made my own arrangements quietly and independently. I hired a private nursing service to provide care during the first week after surgery. I researched recovery requirements and ordered necessary medical equipment. I prepared my house and organized my finances as if I were the only person responsible for my well-being, because experience had taught me that was the truth. The appointment with Patricia Williams took place on a snowy Thursday morning in early January. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with leather-bound books and the kind of heavy wooden furniture that suggested permanence and tradition. Patricia had handled my legal affairs for over a decade, through Richard's death and the various challenges of single parenthood. She was a woman who understood that legal documents were really about protecting the people we love most. I explained to her what I wanted to do, why I wanted to do it, and how I wanted it structured. She listened without judgment, asking clarifying questions and making sure she understood my intentions completely. When I finished explaining my reasoning, she set down her pen and looked at me with the kind of direct honesty that comes from years of experience with family dynamics. "Are you certain about this decision?" she asked. "Once these documents are signed, there's no undoing the emotional impact, even if the legal aspects can be changed later." I thought about her question for a long moment, considering not just my current anger and disappointment but the patterns that had led to this moment. This wasn't a decision made in the heat of emotion, it was the logical conclusion of years of observation and experience. I'm certain, I told her. This isn't about punishment. It's about consequences. I'm 71 years old, and I finally understand the difference. Patricia nodded and began drafting the revised will according to my specifications. As I watched her work, translating my emotions into legal language, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of control. For the first time since my diagnosis, I was making a decision that prioritized my own values and needs rather than someone else's comfort and convenience. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. I was using my death to finally establish boundaries I had never been able to maintain while living. My will would become the ultimate statement about love and reciprocity, about the price of taking someone for granted, about what happens when unconditional giving meets conditional receiving. When the documents were complete, Patricia walked me through every section, ensuring I understood the implications and legal requirements. The language was formal and precise, but the emotional content was unmistakably clear. My estate, accumulated through decades of careful saving and conservative investing, would be distributed according to a new set of priorities that reflected my actual relationships rather than my hopeful illusions. I signed the papers with a steady hand, feeling both the weight of the decision and the lightness of finally acting on my own behalf. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, walking carefully through the snow-covered parking lot, I felt like I was emerging from a long, difficult dream into the clarity of waking life. Emma called that evening to finalize the details of my surgery week. Her voice was bright with the kind of forced cheerfulness people use when they're trying to convince themselves as much as others that everything is fine. She had arranged for meal delivery services, coordinated with her office for extended time away, and even planned activities to keep me entertained during recovery. I listened to her elaborate preparations with a mixture of sadness and appreciation. Part of me hoped that this time would be different, that the gravity of surgery would finally help her understand what I needed from her. But a larger part of me had already moved beyond hope into acceptance. Whether she showed up or not, I would be fine. I had learned to take care of myself in ways that went far beyond the practical necessities of recovery. The night before surgery, I sat in my living room surrounded by the artifacts of a life fully lived. Photographs of my children at various ages covered the mantel, their bright faces capturing moments of joy and accomplishment I had been privileged to witness. Awards from my teaching career lined the bookshelf, recognition for decades of dedication to other people's children. Thank you cards from students and parents filled a decorative box, testimonials to the difference I had made in countless young lives. Looking around that room, I realized that my value as a person wasn't diminished by Emma's inability to recognize it. I had lived a meaningful life, touched many people, and made choices that reflected my deepest values. Her failure to appreciate what I offered said nothing about my worth and everything about her capacity for gratitude and emotional connection. I opened my leather journal one more time before surgery, writing what might be my final entry in its pages. I wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that excuses behavior but the kind that releases you from carrying other people's failures as your own burden. I wrote about love, the real kind that requires presence and sacrifice and attention, not just sentiment and good intentions. Most importantly, I wrote about justice. Not the harsh, punitive kind that seeks to hurt others for hurting us, but the restorative kind that insists on balance and reciprocity and consequences that match choices. My revised will wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. It was about creating a world where actions have meaning, where love is measured in presence rather than promises, where the people who show up for you are the ones who matter when you're gone. As I closed the journal and prepared for what might be my last night in my own home, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my diagnosis: peace. Tomorrow would bring uncertainty and risk, but it would also bring the possibility of cure and the continuation of a life I had finally learned to value properly. Whether Emma chose to be part of that life or not was her decision, but the consequences of that choice were now clearly established. For the first time in months, I fell asleep easily, my dreams filled not with worry about the surgery or sadness about my daughter's absence, but with images of all the ways I might choose to spend whatever time remained to me. In those dreams, I was painting watercolors in Tuscany, learning to play piano, volunteering at the children's hospital, traveling to places I had always wanted to see. I was living fully and intentionally, surrounded by people who valued my presence and deserved my love in return. The woman who would wake up tomorrow morning, whether she survived surgery or not, would be someone different from the woman who had received a cancer diagnosis 4 months earlier. She would be someone who understood her own worth, someone who had learned the difference between being needed and being valued, someone who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. And if Emma wanted to be part of that woman's life, she would have to learn new ways of loving that matched the depth of what was being offered. The days of taking mother's love for granted were over, whether Emma realized it yet or not. The surgery happened exactly as Dr. Chen had described, but nothing else went according to Emma's carefully orchestrated plans. I woke up in the recovery room to the sound of machines monitoring my vital signs and the gentle voice of a nurse named Maria asking how I felt. The first thing I noticed was that I was alone. The second thing I noticed was that I wasn't surprised. Emma had texted at 6 in the morning, just as I was being prepped for surgery. Her mother-in-law had suffered a stroke during the night and was being rushed to a hospital in Milwaukee. She was devastated to miss my surgery, the message read, but family emergencies couldn't be predicted. She would call as soon as she knew more about both situations. I stared at the text on my phone screen, reading it 3 times before the cruel irony fully settled in. On the day I was having surgery to save my life, my daughter was rushing to someone else's medical emergency. The woman who had been too busy to attend my appointments was suddenly available to sit in waiting rooms when the patient was her husband's mother rather than her own. Maria, my recovery nurse, was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. She had been working in oncology for 20 years, she told me, and had seen every possible family dynamic play out in these sterile rooms. When she asked if anyone would be coming to visit during my recovery, I simply said no, not today. She nodded with the understanding of someone who had witnessed many patients navigate serious illness without adequate support. The private nursing service I had hired proved to be exactly what I needed. The agency sent a woman named Carol, a former ICU nurse who had transitioned to private care after 30 years in hospitals. She was professional but warm, competent without being impersonal. She understood that healing required more than medication, schedules and wound care. It required human connection and gentle encouragement. Carol stayed with me for 12 hours each day during the first week after surgery, helping me manage pain medication, assisting with basic mobility, and ensuring I followed all of Dr. Chen's postoperative instructions. She was everything Emma had promised to be: present, attentive, reliable, and focused entirely on my well-being. The difference was that Carol was being paid to care for me, while Emma supposedly loved me enough to do it without compensation. During those first difficult days of recovery, when pain made it hard to think clearly and medication made everything feel dreamlike, I found myself comparing Carol's professional care with Emma's emotional absence. Carol anticipated my needs before I expressed them, noticed subtle changes in my comfort level, and adjusted her approach accordingly. She was skilled at reading the nonverbal cues of someone recovering from major surgery. More importantly, Carol treated me like a whole person rather than a collection of medical problems. She asked about my life before cancer, my interests and hobbies, my thoughts about recovery and the future. She brought books from the library when I mentioned missing reading, and helped me set up a small easel by the window when I expressed interest in trying watercolor painting again. Emma called twice each day, conversations that felt scripted and obligatory. She would ask about my pain levels, whether I was taking my medications properly, if I needed anything from the store. But she never asked how I felt emotionally, what it was like to wake up from surgery alone, or whether I was scared about the pathology results we were still waiting for. Her questions focused on logistics and symptoms rather than the person experiencing them. The pathology results came back better than anyone had dared hope. Dr. Chen called personally to share the news. They had removed all visible cancer tissue, and the margins were completely clear. The lymph nodes showed no signs of remaining disease. I was officially in remission, with an excellent prognosis for full recovery. I received this life-changing news while sitting alone in my kitchen, Carol having stepped out to pick up groceries. The woman who had spent months fearing death was suddenly facing the prospect of many more years of life. It should have been a moment of pure joy, a celebration worthy of champagne and phone calls to everyone I loved. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table holding the phone and feeling profoundly empty. The miracle I had been hoping for had arrived, and there was no one there to witness it. I thought about all the ways Emma might have reacted if she had been present. For that call, tears of relief, an impulsive hug, maybe even a spontaneous plan to celebrate this incredible turn of events. When I called to share the news, Emma's response was enthusiastic but distant. She was thrilled, she said, absolutely thrilled. This was the best possible outcome, exactly what we had all been hoping for. She would come over that weekend to celebrate properly, she promised. Maybe we could go out to dinner, my choice of restaurant. But even her joy felt performative, like she was playing the role of a relieved daughter rather than actually experiencing relief. Her enthusiasm was the kind you might express about a friend's good news rather than the deep, personal gratitude of someone whose loved one had been saved from death. The emotional distance that had characterized her presence throughout my illness remained even in the face of miraculous news. That weekend celebration never happened. Emma's daughter came down with strep throat, requiring quarantine and careful monitoring. The dinner was postponed indefinitely, and once again I found myself processing major news without the person who should have been most invested in sharing it with me. By this time, the pattern was so established that I barely felt disappointed. I had learned to expect nothing and was rarely surprised by receiving exactly that. What did surprise me was how much I was beginning to enjoy my solitude. Without the constant disappointment of broken promises and missed occasions, I found peace in managing my own expectations and creating my own celebrations. I bought myself flowers for the good pathology report, expensive ones from the florist downtown rather than grocery store arrangements. I made reservations at my favorite restaurant and took myself out for a proper celebration dinner, ordering wine and dessert and enjoying every bite without having to manage anyone else's schedule or preferences. I called my son David to share the news, and his genuine excitement and relief reminded me what authentic emotional connection sounded like. Carol continued working with me for another week, helping me regain strength and independence. During our quiet hours together, she shared stories about other patients she had cared for, particularly elderly women who had found themselves navigating serious illness without adequate family support. The stories were both heartbreaking and inspiring, tales of women who had discovered inner strength they never knew they possessed. One story stayed with me long after Carol moved on to her next patient. She had cared for a woman named Dorothy who had raised 6 children, all of whom lived within 30 miles of her home. When Dorothy was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, her children created elaborate schedules for sharing her care, detailed spreadsheets that assigned responsibilities and rotated duties with mathematical precision. But the spreadsheets fell apart. Within weeks, work conflicts arose, family obligations interfered, and gradually Dorothy found herself alone with a diagnosis that required constant attention and support. Instead of becoming bitter or demanding, Dorothy had made a remarkable decision. She sold her house, moved into a beautiful assisted living community, and spent her remaining months surrounded by people who chose to be there rather than people who felt obligated to visit. Dorothy's story resonated with me because it illustrated something I was beginning to understand about the difference between chosen relationships and obligated ones. The staff at Dorothy's assisted living facility cared for her with genuine warmth and attention because they had selected a profession dedicated to elder care. Her children provided sporadic, guilt-driven visits because they felt they should, not because they wanted to. As my physical strength returned and the acute phase of recovery passed, I found myself thinking more and more about Dorothy's wisdom. She had recognized that love without presence is just sentiment, that good intentions without follow-through are meaningless gestures. Most importantly, she had chosen to surround herself with people who valued her company rather than enduring the emotional poverty of relationships based on obligation. Emma's visits during my recovery were perfect examples of obligated love. She would arrive with lists of tasks to accomplish, checking items off like a project manager, ensuring deliverables were met. She organized my pill dispenser with military precision, restocked my refrigerator according to a meal plan she had researched online, and updated my medical information with the efficiency of a personal assistant. But she never simply sat with me. She never asked what I was thinking about during the long hours of recovery, never expressed curiosity about how this experience had changed my perspective on life and mortality. She was so focused on managing my care that she completely missed the opportunity to connect with me as a person going through a transformative experience. The emotional distance became even more apparent when my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, began stopping by regularly during my recovery. Eleanor Henderson was 83 years old, a widow who had lived next door for 15 years. We had always been friendly but not particularly close, our relationship consisting mainly of pleasant conversations over the fence and the occasional borrowed cup of sugar. But when Eleanor learned about my surgery, she became a daily presence in my life. She would arrive each afternoon with homemade soup or fresh bread, staying for an hour or two to chat about everything and nothing. She asked thoughtful questions about my treatment, shared stories about her own health challenges, and listened with genuine interest when I talked about my fears and hopes. Eleanor's visits were everything Emma's were not: relaxed, authentic, and focused on emotional connection rather than task completion. She wasn't trying to fix my situation or manage my recovery, she was simply offering her presence as a gift. We talked about books and gardens, memories of our late husbands, and dreams for whatever years remained ahead of us. The contrast between Eleanor's voluntary companionship and Emma's dutiful caretaking was stark and painful. A neighbor who owed me nothing was providing the emotional support that my daughter, who owed me everything, seemed incapable of offering. Eleanor's kindness was given freely, without expectation or agenda, while Emma's help felt conditional and temporary. During one of Eleanor's visits, about 3 weeks after my surgery, she made an observation that cut straight to the heart of what I had been struggling to understand. We were sitting on my back porch enjoying the mild February sunshine, watching birds at the feeder I had finally felt strong enough to refill. You know, Eleanor said thoughtfully, I've noticed that your daughter visits you the way some people visit graves. She comes because she thinks she should, stays exactly as long as feels proper, and leaves with a sense of duty fulfilled rather than connection enjoyed. Her words were harsh but accurate. Emma did treat our relationship like a memorial service. Something solemn and obligatory that had to be endured rather than a living connection that could bring joy to both participants. She performed the motions of daughterly devotion without experiencing any of the emotions that should accompany them. That same week, I received a call from Patricia Williams asking me to come in for a follow-up appointment regarding my revised will. There were some tax implications we needed to discuss, she explained, and she wanted to make sure I understood all the ramifications of my decisions. I scheduled the appointment for the following Tuesday, curious about what additional complexities might be involved. Patricia's office felt different this time, less like a refuge and more like the scene of a business transaction. She had prepared detailed charts showing how my estate would be distributed according to the new will, with explanations of tax consequences and legal requirements. The numbers were substantial. Decades of careful saving and conservative investing had created more wealth than I had realized. Looking at those charts, I began to understand the full impact of what I had done. Emma's inheritance, under the original will, would have been enough to pay off her mortgage, fund her children's college educations, and provide substantial financial security for the rest of her life. Under the revised will, she would receive a token amount, a symbolic acknowledgement of our biological relationship without any real financial benefit. The bulk of my estate would instead go to organizations that had demonstrated the kind of care and commitment Emma had failed to provide. The children's hospital where I had volunteered for 20 years would receive enough funding to renovate their oncology wing. The scholarship fund I had established in Richard's memory would be endowed permanently. Carol's nursing agency would receive a substantial donation to help provide free care for cancer patients without family support. Patricia walked me through each allocation, ensuring I understood not just the financial impact but the message each bequest would send. This wasn't random redistribution of wealth, it was a careful mapping of my values onto my final wishes. The organizations and people who would benefit from my estate were those who had shown me the kind of care I valued, the kind of attention and presence that Emma had never learned to provide. Are you comfortable with these decisions? Patricia asked as we finished reviewing the documents. Once you pass away, there's no way to explain your reasoning to Emma or help her understand why these choices were made. I thought about her question carefully. The will wasn't really about Emma learning lessons or experiencing consequences during my lifetime. It was about establishing a final statement of values, a permanent record of what I believed love should look like and how care should be provided. Whether Emma understood that message or not was less important than ensuring my estate reflected my actual relationships rather than my hopeful fantasies. I'm comfortable, I told Patricia. This will reflects the relationships that actually sustain me rather than the ones I wished I had. If Emma wanted to inherit my estate, she could have invested in our relationship while I was alive to appreciate it. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, I felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with legal documents. The revised will was simply the external manifestation of an internal transformation that had been months in the making. I had finally learned to value myself the way I had always valued others, to expect from relationships what I was willing to give to them. The weeks following my legal appointment were marked by a gradual return to normal life, though normal now meant something entirely different than it had before my diagnosis. My energy was returning slowly but steadily, and Dr. Chen was pleased with my recovery progress. The follow-up scans showed no signs of remaining cancer, and my prognosis continued to be excellent. But the person emerging from this experience was fundamentally different from the woman who had first heard the word cancer 6 months earlier. That woman had defined herself through her availability to others, measuring her worth by how much she could sacrifice for her children's comfort and convenience. This woman understood that love without reciprocity was just exploitation dressed up in pretty words. The change was evident in small daily choices that would have been unthinkable before my illness. When Emma called to ask if I could babysit the twins so she could attend a work function, I simply said no without offering alternative solutions or elaborate explanations. When she seemed surprised by my refusal, I explained calmly that I was still recovering and needed to prioritize my own health and energy. Her reaction was telling. Instead of expressing concern about my recovery or asking if there was anything she could do to help, she immediately began problem-solving around my unavailability. Could I recommend a babysitter? Did I know any other family members who might be free? Her response confirmed what I had already learned. I had never been a person to her, just a resource to be utilized when needed. I started making plans that had nothing to do with anyone else's schedule or needs. I enrolled in the watercolor painting class I had postponed for years, scheduled the European river cruise I had been saving for since Richard's death, and began volunteering at the animal shelter because spending time with creatures who offered unconditional love seemed healing and appropriate. Each choice was a small act of rebellion against the woman I had been trained to be, the perpetually available mother who existed primarily to serve others' needs. This new version of myself was still loving and generous, but those qualities were now directed toward people and organizations that valued what I offered rather than simply expecting it. Emma noticed the changes, though she seemed unable to interpret what they meant. During one of her increasingly brief visits, she commented that I seemed different somehow, more independent maybe. Was I feeling all right? Was I getting enough social interaction? Should she be concerned about my mental health following the trauma of surgery and treatment? Her questions revealed how little she understood about the transformation that had taken place. She interpreted my newfound self-respect as a possible medical problem rather than recognizing it as evidence of emotional growth and healing. The idea that I might choose to prioritize my own needs didn't register as a positive development but as a symptom requiring intervention. I realized then that Emma had been so accustomed to my endless availability that she couldn't conceive of any other way for me to exist. In her mind, a healthy Lucy Parker was one who dropped everything to meet her family's needs, who measured her own worth by how much she could sacrifice for others' comfort. This Lucy Parker, who made independent plans and established boundaries, was clearly malfunctioning somehow. The conversation that finally crystallized everything happened on a Saturday afternoon in late March. Emma had stopped by unannounced, something she rarely did anymore since I had begun gently enforcing boundaries around my time and space. She seemed agitated, pacing around my living room while making conversation about work stress and the twins' busy spring schedules. Finally, she got to the real reason for her visit. She had been talking to her husband about my recent behavior, she said, and they were both concerned that I might be experiencing some kind of emotional crisis related to my cancer treatment. People sometimes develop depression or anxiety after surviving serious illness, she explained, and she wanted to make sure I was getting appropriate psychological support. The irony was breathtaking. The daughter who had abandoned me during the most frightening experience of my life was now worried that surviving that experience might have damaged my mental health. The woman who had consistently prioritized every other obligation over my medical needs was suddenly concerned about my psychological well-being. Emma, I said carefully, do you remember being present for any of my treatment appointments? She looked confused by the question. I tried to be there when I could, she said defensively. You know how busy things get with work and the kids' schedules. Do you remember which appointments you actually attended? I pressed gently. She frowned, clearly struggling to recall specific instances. The exact details weren't as important as the overall support, she said finally. She had been there in spirit even when she couldn't be there physically. I nodded slowly, understanding finally that we had lived through completely different experiences of my illness. In her memory, she had been a devoted daughter who had provided care and support despite challenging circumstances. In my reality, she had been an absent figure who had consistently prioritized other obligations over my health crisis. The gap between her perception and my experience was so vast that there was no bridge capable of spanning it. She genuinely believed she had been there for me because she had intended to be there, because she had worried about me, because she had felt bad about missing appointments. In her mind, good intentions were equivalent to actual presence. That afternoon, after Emma left with promises to check on me more regularly, I sat in my garden watching the early spring flowers push through the soil. Daffodils and crocuses were blooming despite the cold nights, their bright colors a testament to the power of persistence and the beauty that could emerge from difficult circumstances. I thought about resilience, about the difference between surviving something and learning from it. Cancer had taught me that my time on earth was finite and precious, that every day was a gift that should be spent with intention and purpose. But Emma's abandonment during my illness had taught me something equally valuable, that love without action was just a pretty word, and that I deserved relationships based on mutual care rather than one-sided devotion. The woman who had entered this experience believing that good mothers sacrificed everything for their children had emerged understanding that good relationships required investment from both parties. The woman who had measured her worth by how much she could give away had learned to value what she brought to the world and insist that others value it too. As spring progressed and my strength continued to return, I found myself looking forward rather than backward for the first time in months. The future stretched ahead not as a burden to be endured but as an opportunity to be embraced. I had been given a second chance at life, and I intended to live it according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. The revised will sitting in Patricia Williams' office was just the beginning. The real transformation was happening inside me, a fundamental shift from people-pleasing to self-respect, from unconditional giving to reciprocal love. Emma could choose to be part of this new chapter of my life, but only if she learned to value what was being offered rather than simply expecting it to always be available. Whether she was capable of that kind of growth remained to be seen. But, for the first time in my adult life, her choice would determine her place in my world rather than my choice determining how much of myself I was willing to sacrifice for hers. The balance of power had shifted, quietly but permanently, and I was finally ready to see what kind of life I could build when I stopped apologizing for taking up space in it. The revelation came through a grocery store encounter on a Tuesday morning in April, 6 weeks after my last chemotherapy treatment and 3 months into what Dr. Chen optimistically called my new normal. I was selecting oranges in the produce section when I heard a familiar voice behind me, animated and cheerful in a way that made me pause. "Oh my goodness, you look fantastic," the voice exclaimed. "I heard about your mom's situation and I've been meaning to call. How is everything going?" I turned to see Emma deep in conversation with Janet Morrison, a woman from our old neighborhood whose daughter had gone to school with Emma. Janet was holding a small bouquet of flowers and seemed genuinely concerned. The kind of expression people wear when discussing serious family matters. "It's been incredibly difficult," Emma was saying, her voice taking on the weary tone of someone carrying a heavy burden. "Mom's been so sick, and you know how stubborn she can be about accepting help. I basically had to put my entire life on hold to take care of her." I stood frozen behind a display of citrus fruits, my basket forgotten in my hands. The woman I was listening to bore no resemblance to the daughter who had missed most of my appointments, who had been absent from my surgery, who had consistently prioritized every other obligation over my health needs. "That must be exhausting." "For you," Janet responded sympathetically. "I don't know how you manage it all with your job and the twins. You're such a devoted daughter." Emma sighed dramatically. "It really has been overwhelming. The constant doctor appointments, the medications, making sure she's eating properly, managing her emotional needs. Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning in responsibility, but what choice do I have? She's my mother." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Emma painting herself as a martyred caregiver sacrificing everything for her demanding, difficult mother. She described sleepless nights worried about my condition, the strain on her marriage from constantly being away to care for me, the guilt she felt when work obligations prevented her from being at my bedside. It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right mixture of exhaustion and nobility. Janet listened with growing admiration, occasionally reaching out to touch Emma's arm in sympathy. By the end of their conversation, Emma had thoroughly established herself as the long-suffering daughter who had heroically stepped up to care for her ailing mother despite enormous personal cost. I remained hidden behind the orange display until they parted ways, Janet promising to keep me in her prayers and Emma accepting the offer with gracious humility. Only when Emma had disappeared around the corner toward the dairy section did I emerge from my hiding place, my hands shaking and my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. The woman who had been absent from my life during the most frightening months I had ever experienced was telling the world that she had sacrificed everything to care for me. The daughter who couldn't find time to sit with me during chemotherapy was claiming credit for managing my emotional needs. The person who had missed my surgery for another family emergency was positioning herself as overwhelmed by the demands of my care. I abandoned my grocery shopping and drove home in a daze, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of Emma's deception. This wasn't just self-delusion or wishful thinking. This was calculated manipulation of the truth for social and emotional benefit. She was harvesting sympathy and admiration for sacrifices she had never made, positioning herself as a devoted daughter while I experienced the reality of her absence. That evening, I called my friend Margaret, a retired social worker who had known our family for 15 years. Margaret was direct and insightful, someone who had spent her career understanding family dynamics and recognizing patterns of dysfunction. I told her about the grocery store encounter, about the disconnect between Emma's public narrative and my lived experience. Margaret listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions about specific incidents during my treatment. When I finished describing the conversation I had overheard, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Lucy," she said carefully, "what you're describing sounds like something we used to see occasionally in my practice. Some people create elaborate fiction about their relationships to maintain their image as caring family members. They genuinely seem to believe their own stories, even when they contradict observable reality." She explained that this kind of behavior often developed in people who needed to see themselves as good and caring but lacked the capacity for the actual work that genuine care required. They resolved the cognitive dissonance by creating alternative narratives that allowed them to maintain their self-image without changing their behavior. The most disturbing part, Margaret continued, is that they often receive real social benefits from these false narratives. People admire them for their supposed sacrifices, support them through their fictional struggles, and never realize that the person they're sympathizing with is actually the one causing harm. Her words crystallized something I had been struggling to understand about Emma's behavior throughout my illness. It wasn't just that she had been absent, it was that she had somehow transformed her absence into a form of presence in her own mind and in her public presentation. She had managed to be both neglectful and admired for her devotion simultaneously. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to how Emma talked about our relationship with others. During a family barbecue at my son David's house, I listened as she regaled his wife with stories about managing my care schedule and coordinating with my medical team. She spoke with authority about my treatment protocol and recovery timeline, details she could only have learned from our brief phone conversations rather than direct involvement. When David's wife expressed admiration for Emma's dedication, Emma accepted the praise with the weary grace of someone carrying a heavy burden. She mentioned the financial strain of constantly traveling back and forth to help me, the emotional toll of watching a parent struggle with serious illness, the difficulty of balancing her own family's needs with mine. The conversation was so far removed from reality that I felt like I was listening to someone describe a parallel universe. In Emma's version of events, she was the central figure in my cancer journey, the devoted daughter whose constant presence and careful management had been essential to my recovery. The actual Lucy Parker, who had navigated most of the experience alone, barely existed in this narrative. What made the deception even more troubling was how convincing it was. Emma spoke with genuine emotion about experiences she had never had, displayed real fatigue from fictional sacrifices, and seemed to actually feel the burden of care she claimed to be providing. Her performance was so authentic because, in some psychological sense, she believed her own story. I began to wonder how long this pattern had been operating in our relationship. How many times over the years had Emma taken credit for support she hadn't provided, claimed sacrifices she hadn't made, positioned herself as more involved in my life than she actually was? How much of the admiration she received from friends and extended family was based on a completely false understanding of our relationship? The thought led me to review other significant events in our family history through this new lens. When Richard died suddenly, leaving me with 3 young children and enormous financial uncertainty, everyone had praised Emma for stepping up to help her younger siblings. But looking back, I realized that most of the actual help had come from neighbors, church members, and my own extended family. Emma had been away at college, calling regularly to check in but rarely coming home except for scheduled breaks. Yet, somehow, in family lore, Emma had become the responsible older sister who had helped hold the family together during our crisis. People spoke admiringly of how mature she had been, how she had sacrificed her college experience to support her family. The reality that she had maintained her normal academic and social schedule while I struggled alone with grief and single parenthood had been erased from collective memory. The pattern extended to other family milestones as well. When David deployed to Afghanistan, everyone praised Emma for being such a supportive sister, staying in close contact and helping me cope with the worry of having a child in a combat zone. In reality, Emma had been so busy with her new job and budding romance that she rarely called David and often forgot to ask me how I was handling the stress of his deployment. When Michael went through his addiction struggles, people admired Emma's tough love approach and her commitment to helping him find treatment. The truth was that Emma had written Michael off completely during his worst period, refusing to speak to him for months and discouraging me from providing any support. She had only resumed contact after he achieved sobriety, then somehow received credit for his recovery. Each revelation felt like discovering that my life had been rewritten by someone else, that the relationships I thought I understood had been replaced by fictional versions that served Emma's image but bore no resemblance to actual events. The daughter I believed I knew was largely a creation of selective memory and strategic narrative construction. The most painful realization was understanding how my own enabling had contributed to this pattern. By never correcting Emma's false narratives, by allowing people to praise her for sacrifices she hadn't made, by protecting her reputation even when it meant erasing my own experience, I had become complicit in my own invisibility. Every time someone complimented Emma on her devotion to family, I had smiled and nodded rather than pointing out the discrepancies between perception and reality. When people expressed sympathy for the burden Emma carried as the responsible daughter, I had accepted their concern graciously rather than explaining that most of that burden had actually fallen on David, Michael, or me. I had been so invested in maintaining family harmony and protecting Emma's image that I had allowed my own contributions to be minimized or erased entirely. The pattern that had culminated in her absence during my cancer treatment had been decades in the making, enabled by my own reluctance to insist on accurate recognition of who was actually doing the work of maintaining family relationships. The discovery process accelerated when I decided to look more carefully at Emma's social media presence, something I had rarely paid attention to before. Her Facebook and Instagram accounts told a story of devoted daughter managing elderly parents. Health crisis with grace and compassion. Photos of flowers she had supposedly brought me, meals she claimed to have prepared, medication schedules she had allegedly organized. Many of the images were real, but the context was entirely fabricated. The flowers were ones I had bought for myself, photographed during one of her brief visits and presented as evidence of her thoughtful care. The meals were takeout containers from restaurants, staged to look like home-cooked food she had prepared for my recovery. The medication organizer was one I had set up myself, photographed and presented as evidence of her careful management of my treatment. Each post generated dozens of supportive comments from friends and acquaintances praising Emma's dedication and expressing admiration for her sacrifice. She responded to these comments with humble gratitude, occasionally sharing additional details about the challenges of caregiving and the emotional toll of watching a parent face serious illness. The social media narrative was so compelling that even I began to doubt my own memories. Had Emma been more present than I remembered? Was I being unfair in my assessment of her involvement? The carefully curated images and accompanying stories created a version of reality that seemed more real than my actual experience. But the documentation I had kept during my treatment told a different story. My medical appointment calendar showed Emma's presence at fewer than 20% of my visits. The journal I had maintained throughout treatment recorded my feelings of abandonment and isolation in detail. The thank you cards I had written to Carol, Eleanor, and other people who had actually provided support during my illness demonstrated where genuine care had come from. Confronted with this evidence, I realized that Emma's social media presence was essentially an elaborate work of fiction designed to generate sympathy and admiration for fictional sacrifices. She was receiving emotional and social benefits for care she had never provided, positioning herself as a devoted daughter while leaving me to navigate my health crisis largely alone. The pattern extended beyond social media to her interactions with extended family and mutual friends. During a phone conversation with my sister Ruth, who lived in California and kept in touch primarily through holiday cards and occasional calls, I discovered that Emma had been providing regular updates about my condition and her role in managing it. According to Ruth, Emma had called several times during my treatment to share the emotional burden of caring for me. She had described the difficulty of coordinating my medical appointments, the stress of managing my medications, and the challenge of keeping my spirits up during the darkest periods of treatment. Ruth had been moved by Emma's dedication and had sent flowers and encouraging cards specifically to support Emma through this difficult time. The conversation with Ruth revealed that Emma had created an entire network of people who believed they were supporting her through the fictional burden of caring for me. Friends and relatives who rarely communicated with me directly had been rallying around Emma, offering emotional support and practical assistance for sacrifices she had never made. When I gently corrected some of Ruth's assumptions about Emma's level of involvement, my sister seemed confused and defensive. She had been receiving detailed updates from Emma for months, she protested. She had specific examples of Emma's sacrifices and could hardly believe that her information was inaccurate. The conversation highlighted another disturbing aspect of Emma's deception. It had created a support network for her that was based entirely on false premises. While I had struggled through cancer treatment with minimal family support, Emma had been receiving emotional care and encouragement from people who believed she was heroically managing my care. She had essentially stolen the support that should have been directed toward me, redirecting sympathy and assistance intended for cancer patient toward herself as the supposed caregiver. The people who cared about our family had been manipulated into supporting the wrong person, their genuine concern weaponized to benefit someone who was actually providing minimal help. I began to understand that this wasn't simply a case of someone exaggerating their contributions or remembering events more favorably than they had actually occurred. This was systematic emotional fraud, a calculated campaign to harvest sympathy and admiration for fictional sacrifices while leaving the actual burden of care to be carried by others. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Emma had managed to create an entire alternative reality in which she was the devoted daughter, sacrificing everything for her ailing mother, while simultaneously living a life that prioritized her own convenience and comfort over my actual needs. She had received praise, support, and admiration for being exactly the opposite of what she actually was. During this period of discovery, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about my relationship with Emma and her character. If she was capable of such elaborate deception about something as serious as cancer treatment, what other aspects of our relationship had been built on fictional foundations? I started examining past conversations and interactions with new skepticism, looking for other instances where Emma's version of events had differed significantly from my own experience. The pattern was easier to see once I knew what to look for. Emma consistently positioned herself as more involved, more caring, and more sacrificial than she actually was. The discovery process was emotionally devastating but also strangely liberating. For months, I had been wondering what was wrong with me, that my own daughter seemed incapable of providing basic emotional support during a health crisis. Learning that Emma was actually receiving praise and sympathy for the very support she wasn't providing helped me understand that the problem wasn't my worthiness for care but her capacity for authentic relationship. The woman I thought I had raised, the successful daughter I had been proud of for decades, was revealed to be someone capable of profound emotional manipulation and calculated deception. The realization forced me to reconsider not just our current relationship but the entire foundation of trust and love I thought we had built together. As spring progressed and my physical health continued to improve, I found myself grappling with grief that had nothing to do with cancer. I was mourning the loss of illusions, the death of a relationship I now understood had never actually existed. The Emma I thought I knew had been largely a creation of my own hopes and her careful image management. The daughter who existed in reality was someone far more calculating and manipulative than I had ever imagined. She was capable of watching me struggle through cancer treatment alone while simultaneously claiming credit for providing care I never received. She could look me in the eye during brief, obligatory visits while telling the world that she was overwhelmed by the burden of caring for me. This revelation changed everything about how I understood our relationship and what it meant for my future. The woman I had planned to spend my remaining years with, the daughter I had hoped would be my companion through aging and eventual decline, was someone who would likely continue harvesting sympathy for fictional caregiving while providing minimal actual support. The revised will sitting in Patricia Williams' office suddenly seemed not just appropriate but essential. Emma had revealed herself to be someone who took credit for sacrifices she didn't make and claimed benefits she hadn't earned. Leaving her a substantial inheritance would essentially be rewarding her for decades of emotional manipulation and calculated deception. More importantly, I realized that Emma's capacity for rewriting reality meant that my death would likely become another opportunity for her to position herself as the devoted daughter who had sacrificed everything to care for her aging mother. She would probably receive sympathy and admiration for losses she hadn't actually experienced, positioning herself as the grieving daughter who had done everything possible to support me through my final years. The thought of Emma receiving praise and comfort for a fictional relationship while the people who actually cared for me remained unrecognized was unbearable. My will needed to be more than just a distribution of assets, it needed to be a permanent record of truth, a correction to the false narrative that Emma would inevitably construct around my death. As I sat in my garden that evening, watching the late spring flowers bloom in the fading sunlight, I felt a strange sense of peace despite the painful revelations of recent weeks. Understanding the truth about Emma's character was devastating, but also clarifying. I no longer needed to wonder why my own daughter seemed incapable of basic care and compassion. She was perfectly capable of both, but only when they served her image rather than someone else's needs. The woman I would be moving forward would be someone who insisted on truth in relationships, who valued authenticity over performance, who surrounded herself with people capable of genuine connection rather than elaborate deception. Emma could continue creating fictional narratives about our relationship, but she would no longer have access to the benefits of actually being in relationship with me. The cancer that had threatened to kill me had ultimately saved me from a lifetime of being invisible in my own family. The treatment that had revealed Emma's capacity for abandonment had also revealed my capacity for independence and self-respect. I had survived both the disease and the discovery, and I was finally ready to build a life based on truth rather than the comfortable illusions I had maintained for decades. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began the morning after my conversation with Ruth. I woke up feeling different, lighter somehow, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted while I slept. For the first time in months, I didn't reach for my phone to check if Emma had sent one of her perfunctory "How are you feeling?" texts. Instead, I made coffee, sat on my back porch, and watched the sunrise paint my garden in shades of gold and pink. The woman sitting in that chair, breathing in the sweet scent of blooming lilacs, was someone I barely recognized. She wasn't waiting for anyone's permission to enjoy the morning, wasn't organizing her day around other people's schedules, wasn't measuring her worth by how useful she could be to her adult children. She was simply present in her own life, perhaps for the first time in decades. I called the community college that morning and enrolled in 3 classes that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or expectations. Advanced watercolor painting, Introduction to Italian Language, and a literature course focusing on women writers I had always wanted to read but never found time for. When the registration clerk asked if I was sure I wanted to take such a full course load, I laughed and said I had spent too many years not learning new things. The laughter surprised me. It had been so long since I felt genuine joy about my own choices that I had forgotten what it sounded like. The woman who had spent months feeling invisible was suddenly eager to be seen, to participate, to engage with the world as someone who had interests and opinions and dreams that belonged to her alone. That afternoon, I drove to the art supply store and spent 2 hours selecting paints and brushes with the care and attention I usually reserved for other people's needs. The sales clerk was a young woman named Sophie who was studying art therapy at the local university. She helped me choose materials and shared her enthusiasm for the healing power of creative expression. As she rang up my purchases, Sophie mentioned that she was working with cancer patients as part of her practicum, helping them process their experiences through art. The conversation that followed was remarkable in its authenticity. Sophie asked thoughtful questions about my treatment experience, listened with genuine interest to my responses, and shared insights about the connection between creativity and recovery that resonated deeply. In 30 minutes of conversation with a stranger, I received more authentic engagement about my cancer journey than I had experienced with Emma in 6 months. Sophie's interest wasn't performative or obligated, it came from genuine curiosity and professional passion. She saw me as a whole person rather than a collection of medical problems or family responsibilities. When I mentioned that I was feeling ready to create art that reflected my experience rather than hiding from it, Sophie's eyes lit up. She told me about a support group for cancer survivors that met at the community center, led by an art therapist who specialized in helping people process trauma through creative expression. Would I be interested in joining them? The old Lucy would have declined, worried about taking time away from family obligations or uncomfortable with sharing personal experiences with strangers. This Lucy said yes immediately, surprising herself with the enthusiasm in her voice. Sophie wrote down the meeting details on the back of my receipt, adding her own phone number in case I had questions about the group. Driving home with a car full of art supplies and information about a support group, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my diagnosis: anticipation. Not anxiety about what might go wrong, but genuine excitement about what might go right. I was making choices based on my own interests and needs, and the world hadn't collapsed around me. The evening brought another revelation when Michael called from Denver, where he was working a contract at the Children's Hospital. Our conversation was easy and natural, the kind of exchange I had almost forgotten was possible with my children. He asked detailed questions about my recovery, shared funny stories from work, and listened with obvious interest when I told him about my morning at the art supply store. Near the end of our conversation, Michael said something that stopped me cold. "Mom, I have to tell you something that's been bothering me. During your treatment, when I would ask Emma how you were doing, her updates never matched what you told me directly. She made it sound like you were much sicker and more dependent than you seemed when I talked to you myself." His observation confirmed what I had been discovering about Emma's fictional narratives, but hearing it from Michael added another layer of understanding. Emma hadn't just been exaggerating her own involvement, she had been misrepresenting my condition and capacity to other family members. She had portrayed me as more helpless and needy than I actually was, perhaps to make her fictional caregiving seem more heroic and necessary. Michael continued, "I started wondering if she was trying to keep David and me from coming home to help by making it seem like she had everything under control. But if she wasn't actually there much, then you were going through all of this more alone than any of us realized." The conversation with Michael lasted another hour, during which we pieced together a more accurate picture of Emma's behavior throughout my treatment. Michael had offered multiple times to use vacation days to come home and help, but Emma had consistently assured him that it wasn't necessary, that she was managing everything, that additional family presence might actually be overwhelming for me. David had received similar messages when he called to offer support. Emma had positioned herself as the gatekeeper of my care, discouraging other family members from visiting or helping while simultaneously claiming to be overwhelmed by the burden of managing everything alone. She had essentially isolated me from potential support while harvesting sympathy for fictional sacrifices. The conversation with Michael was healing in ways I hadn't expected. He expressed genuine regret about not being more present during my treatment, explaining that he had trusted Emma's assurances that my needs were being met. When I told him the truth about her actual level of involvement, he was quiet for a long moment before saying, "Mom, I'm so sorry. We should have been there for you." His words were simple but profound. This was what authentic care sounded like: recognition of actual needs, genuine regret about missed opportunities to help, commitment to doing better in the future. The contrast with Emma's performative concern and fictional narratives was stark and clarifying. After ending the call with Michael, I sat in my living room feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the warmth of being truly seen and valued by one of my children. Michael's concern was real, his regret genuine, his love expressed through actual attention rather than empty promises or social media performances. The experience prompted me to reach out to David, who was between deployments and stationed in North Carolina. Our conversation followed a similar pattern, with David expressing shock and regret when he learned about Emma's absence during my treatment. Like Michael, he had trusted Emma's updates and assurances that my needs were being met. "I should have come home anyway," David said, his voice heavy with regret. "I kept thinking that maybe I was being overprotective, that Emma knew better. Then I did what you needed. I should have trusted my instincts and just showed up." Both of my sons began making plans to visit more regularly, not out of guilt but from genuine desire to be more present in my life. They started calling more frequently, not to check on my medical condition but to share their lives and learn about mine. The relationships that had felt distant and obligatory began transforming into something warmer and more reciprocal. The contrast with Emma became even more apparent as my relationships with my sons deepened. While Michael and David were making efforts to increase their presence in my life, Emma's visits became increasingly sporadic and superficial. She seemed uncomfortable with my growing independence and vitality, as if my recovery threatened some narrative she needed to maintain. During one of her brief visits in May, Emma seemed agitated and distracted, scrolling through her phone while making small talk about the twins' end-of-school activities. When I mentioned my community college classes and art group, she looked up with a frown and asked if I was sure I should be taking on so many commitments while still recovering. Her concern felt performative rather than genuine, motivated more by discomfort with my independence than worry about my health. The woman who had been too busy to attend my medical appointments was suddenly worried that I might be overextending myself by taking painting classes and learning Italian. I realized that Emma's version of me required a certain level of dependence and limitation. The sick, needy mother who required her management and care fit her narrative better than the healthy, independent woman who was building a fulfilling life without her input. My recovery threatened the fiction she had constructed about being my primary caregiver and emotional support. The art therapy group that Sophie had recommended became a cornerstone of my new life. The group met twice a week at the community center, bringing together 8 cancer survivors in various stages of treatment and recovery. The facilitator was Dr. Patricia Reeves, a licensed therapist and practicing artist who had developed specialized techniques for helping people process medical trauma through creative expression. The first session was intimidating in the way that all new experiences are when you've spent years avoiding them. The other group members ranged in age from 35 to 82, representing different types of cancer and stages of treatment. What united us wasn't our diagnoses but our shared understanding of what it meant to face mortality and emerge changed by the experience. Dr. Reeves began each session with a brief meditation, followed by guided exercises designed to help us access and express emotions that were difficult to put into words. The first exercise asked us to paint our feelings about our bodies before and after cancer. I found myself creating abstract swirls of color that somehow captured the fear, anger, and eventual acceptance I had experienced as my body became a battlefield rather than a reliable home. The process of creating art about my experience was both cathartic and revelatory. Colors and shapes emerged from my brush that seemed to know things about my emotional journey that my conscious mind hadn't fully processed. The act of making something beautiful from the raw material of pain felt like a kind of alchemy, transforming suffering into something that could be witnessed and shared. More importantly, the group provided me with relationships based on authentic connection rather than obligation or performance. These were people who understood the particular loneliness of serious illness, the way it could reveal both the depth and shallowness of existing relationships. We shared stories about family members who had surprised us with their presence or absence during treatment, creating a space where truth-telling was valued over social nicety. During one session in late May, the group was discussing the challenge of rebuilding trust in relationships that had been damaged by the stress of illness. Maria, a breast cancer survivor in her 40s, shared that her sister had been remarkably absent during her treatment but was now posting social media tributes about their unbreakable bond and how proud she was of Maria's courage. "It's like she's trying to rewrite history," Maria said, her voice heavy with frustration. "She wasn't there when I needed her, but now she wants credit for supporting me through it. How do you forgive someone for stealing the narrative of your own experience?" Her words resonated so deeply that I found myself sharing Emma's story for the first time with people outside my immediate family. I told the group about the grocery store encounter, the social media fabrications, the discovery that Emma had been claiming credit for care she hadn't provided while I navigated treatment largely alone. The response from the group was immediate and supportive. Several other members shared similar experiences of family members who had been absent during treatment but present for the praise and sympathy that came from being associated with a cancer patient. Dr. Reeves noted that this pattern was unfortunately common, reflecting broader cultural issues around how we understand and value caregiving. Sometimes the people who do the least work are the most vocal about their sacrifices, Dr. Reeves observed. It's a form of emotional theft that leaves the actual patient feeling both abandoned and erased. Your feelings about this are completely valid, Lucy. Having my experience validated by people who understood the unique vulnerabilities of serious illness was profoundly healing. For months, I had wondered if I was being unfair to Emma, if my expectations were unreasonable, if I should be grateful for whatever limited support she had provided. The group helped me understand that expecting presence and honesty from family members during health crises wasn't unreasonable, it was basic human decency. The art therapy sessions became a laboratory for processing not just my cancer experience but the broader patterns of relationship and self-advocacy that the illness had revealed. I created paintings about invisibility and recognition, about the difference between being needed and being valued, about the courage required to insist on truth in relationships that preferred comfortable fiction. One piece that emerged from these sessions particularly captured my transformation. It was a self-portrait in watercolor, but instead of depicting my physical appearance, I painted myself as I felt internally, a figure emerging from shadow into light, with hands extended toward a bright horizon rather than reaching back toward a gray past. The woman in the painting was facing forward, moving toward something beautiful rather than clinging to something that had never actually existed. During the weeks I was working on this painting, Emma's visits became even more infrequent and strained. She seemed increasingly uncomfortable with my growing vitality and independence, often making comments about hoping I wasn't overdoing it or suggesting that I should be more careful about my energy levels. Her concern felt controlling rather than caring, motivated by discomfort with my autonomy rather than genuine worry about my health. The tension came to a head during a visit in early June, when Emma arrived to find me preparing for an evening art class. I was wearing a new dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, had spent time on my hair and makeup, and was clearly excited about the social aspect of the class as much as the creative component. Emma's reaction was immediate and negative. "Mom, are you sure you should be going out at night? You're still recovering from major surgery, and you know how tired you get. Maybe you should take it easy tonight." Her words were ostensibly caring, but her tone carried an undertone of disapproval that had nothing to do with my health and everything to do with her discomfort with my independence. The woman she needed me to be was quiet, limited, and dependent on her management and care. This version of me, eager to engage with the world and capable of making my own decisions about my energy and activities, threatened the narrative she had constructed. I looked at Emma directly and said something that surprised both of us. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm perfectly capable of deciding what my body can handle. I've been managing my own energy and health for 6 months now, and I'm doing quite well." Her reaction was swift and revealing. Instead of backing down or acknowledging my autonomy, she doubled down on her concern, citing my age, my recent treatment, and the importance of not pushing myself too hard. But underneath her words was a clear message: she needed me to remain limited and dependent in order to maintain her role as the concerned, managing daughter. For the first time in our adult relationship, I refused to defer to her judgment about my own capabilities. I gathered my art supplies, kissed her goodbye, and left for my class despite her continued protests. The act of prioritizing my own assessment of my needs over her fictional concern felt revolutionary, a small but significant assertion of autonomy that had been decades in the making. The art class that night was wonderful in ways that had nothing to do with artistic technique and everything to do with human connection. I found myself laughing easily, engaging in conversations about books and travel and current events, feeling like a full person rather than a collection of medical conditions or family obligations. The other students were curious about my paintings and interested in my perspectives, treating me as someone with valuable contributions rather than someone who needed management. When I returned home that evening, energized rather than exhausted by the social interaction, I found a text from Emma expressing hope that I hadn't overexerted myself and reminding me to call if I needed anything. The message confirmed what I had begun to understand: Emma's concern about my activities had nothing to do with my actual well-being and everything to do with maintaining a dynamic that positioned her as necessary and me as limited. The realization was both liberating and sad. Liberating because it freed me from the obligation to perform helplessness to accommodate Emma's need to feel important. Sad because it confirmed that our relationship was based on roles rather than genuine connection. Emma needed me to be someone who required her management, and I was no longer willing to perform that version of myself to maintain our relationship. Over the following weeks, I began making choices that prioritized my own growth and happiness over Emma's comfort with my dependence. I booked the European river cruise I had been postponing for years, scheduled to depart in September when my energy would be fully restored. I started volunteering at the literacy center, teaching adults who were learning to read, work that felt meaningful and utilized skills that had nothing to do with my medical history. Most significantly, I began developing friendships with people who knew me as I was now rather than as I had been in my role as the perpetually available mother. The relationships I formed through art class, the support group, and volunteer work were based on mutual interests and genuine connection rather than family obligation or historical precedent. These new relationships showed me what authentic care looked like when it wasn't tainted by guilt, manipulation, or performance. When someone in my art class mentioned feeling unwell, others offered genuine support without expecting credit or recognition. When a member of the support group needed practical help, the assistance was provided quietly and without fanfare. The contrast with Emma's performative caring and credit-seeking was stark and educational. I also began reaching out to old friendships that had been neglected during the years I spent prioritizing family obligations over personal connections. Margaret, my retired social worker friend, became a regular companion for museum visits and poetry readings. Eleanor, my neighbor, and I started a weekly tradition of sharing dinner and discussing books we had both read. These relationships, based on reciprocity and mutual enjoyment rather than one-sided giving, reminded me what I had been missing during the decades I spent defining myself primarily as a mother and caregiver. I was a person with interests, opinions, and experiences that had value independent of my usefulness to my adult children. The transformation extended to my physical environment as well. I redecorated my living spaces to reflect my own aesthetic preferences rather than maintaining them as shrines to family memories or stages for other people's comfort. I converted Richard's former office into a proper art studio, complete with professional lighting and storage for supplies. I rearranged the living room to create a reading nook by the window, a space designed for my solitary enjoyment rather than family gatherings. Each change was small but symbolically significant, marking my transition from woman who existed primarily to serve others' needs to someone who valued her own comfort and preferences. The house began to feel like my home rather than a museum dedicated to relationships that had never been as mutual as I had believed. As summer progressed and my one-year anniversary of diagnosis approached, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that cancer had brought into my life. The disease had threatened to kill me, but the treatment experience had revealed truths about my relationships and myself that might have remained hidden for decades otherwise. Without the crisis of serious illness, I might never have discovered Emma's capacity for emotional manipulation and fictional narrative construction. I might have continued sacrificing my own needs and interests to maintain a relationship that was fundamentally one-sided and built on false premises. I might have spent my remaining years serving someone who saw me as a resource rather than a person deserving of genuine care and respect. The cancer that had initially seemed like a disaster had actually been a revelation, stripping away illusions and exposing the truth about what my relationships actually were rather than what I had hoped they might become. The woman who emerged from treatment was healthier in every sense, not just physically but emotionally and psychologically as well. By midsummer, I had stopped expecting anything from Emma beyond the bare minimum of social contact. I didn't hope for her presence at important events, didn't anticipate her support during difficult moments, didn't assume her interest in my thoughts or feelings. This wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I had finally learned to see her as she actually was rather than as I wished she could be. The liberation that came from releasing these expectations was profound. No longer waiting for Emma to become the daughter I needed allowed me to appreciate the relationships I actually had with people who were capable of genuine connection and mutual care. I stopped measuring all my relationships against the fictional standard of unconditional family love and started valuing them for the authentic care and companionship they actually provided. The revised will that Patricia Williams had prepared no longer felt like an act of revenge or punishment. It had become a natural expression of my values and a practical distribution of resources to people and organizations that had demonstrated genuine care for my well-being. Emma's absence from that distribution wasn't a rejection of our biological relationship. It was simply an honest accounting of our actual relationship rather than the fictional one she had constructed for public consumption. As August arrived and I prepared for the art show where several pieces from our therapy group would be displayed, I felt ready to share my story more broadly. Not the sanitized version that protected Emma's reputation, but the true story of what it meant to face cancer largely alone while a family member claimed credit for support she hadn't provided. The woman who would stand beside her paintings that autumn, explaining her artistic journey to strangers and friends alike, would be someone fundamentally different from the woman who had received a cancer diagnosis 12 months earlier. She would be someone who understood her own worth, someone who insisted on truth in relationships, someone who had learned the difference between being needed and being valued. And if Emma wanted to be part of that woman's life moving forward, she would have to learn new ways of relating that matched the depth and authenticity of what was being offered. The days of performing helplessness to accommodate someone else's need to feel important were over, permanently and irrevocably. The confrontation came on a September afternoon, exactly 1 year after my diagnosis. I hadn't planned it that way, but life has a way of creating symbolic moments when you least expect them. I was in my studio working on a new painting when Emma arrived unannounced, something she had been doing more frequently as my independence grew and her narrative became harder to maintain. She found me standing before an easel, brush in hand, completely absorbed in capturing the interplay of light and shadow across a landscape I had photographed during my recent trip to the mountains. The painting was vibrant and alive, full of movement and energy that reflected how I felt about my life now rather than how I had felt during the dark months of treatment. Emma stood in the doorway for several minutes before I noticed her presence. When I turned, startled by movement in my peripheral vision, I saw something in her expression I had never seen before: genuine shock. She was staring at me as if seeing a stranger, taking in my paint-stained apron, my focused concentration, the canvases covering every available surface of the studio. "Mom," she said slowly, "what is all this?" The question might have sounded supportive coming from someone else, an expression of interest in a new hobby or admiration for unexpected creativity. From Emma, it carried an undertone of accusation, as if my artistic pursuits were somehow inappropriate or excessive. I set down my brush and looked around the studio with pride. The space was filled with evidence of months of creative exploration. Landscapes from my travels, abstract expressions of my cancer journey, portraits of people who had shown me kindness during difficult times. The walls displayed a visual autobiography of my transformation from invisible caregiver to visible artist. "This is my life," I said simply. "This is what I do now." Emma walked slowly around the studio, examining paintings with the careful attention of someone conducting an investigation. She paused at a self-portrait I had completed just weeks earlier, a piece that showed me not as I looked in mirrors but as I felt inside, strong, vibrant, unashamed of taking up space in the world. "I had no idea you were doing all this," she said, her voice carrying a note of complaint rather than celebration. "When did you have time for so much painting?" The question revealed everything about how Emma understood my life and my time. In her mind, my days should have been filled with recovery activities, medical appointments, and careful management of my energy. The idea that I might have been engaged in purposeful, joyful creative work challenged her assumption that cancer survivors should remain focused primarily on their medical status. "I've had plenty of time," I replied. "The same hours everyone else has, just organized around different priorities." She continued her circuit of the studio, stopping at a painting that depicted empty chairs in various settings: a hospital waiting room, a restaurant table, a theater seat. The piece was titled "Reserved for No One" and represented my growing comfort with solitude and self-sufficiency. "This one seems sad," Emma said, though her tone suggested she found it more troubling than melancholy. "Are you feeling isolated? Maybe you should talk to someone about depression." The suggestion was classic Emma, reframing my emotional growth as a potential medical problem that required professional intervention. She seemed incapable of recognizing that choosing solitude was different from experiencing loneliness, that finding peace in my own company represented strength rather than withdrawal. "I'm not depressed," I said calmly. "I'm selective about how I spend my time and who I spend it with. There's a difference." Emma's discomfort with my answer was visible. She had built her identity around being needed, around managing other people's lives and solving their problems. My contentment with independence threatened the foundation of how she understood relationships and her own value within them. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time in our adult relationship, I spoke to Emma with complete honesty about what I had observed during my illness and what I had learned about her character as a result. I told her about the grocery store encounter, about discovering her social media fabrications, about learning that she had discouraged my sons from visiting while claiming to be overwhelmed by caring for me. Her response was predictable but still shocking in its audacity. She denied nothing directly but reframed everything as misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The grocery store conversation had been taken out of context, she claimed. Her social media posts were meant to honor my strength, not exaggerate her involvement. Her communication with Michael and David had been motivated by concern that too many visitors would overwhelm me during treatment. Each explanation was technically plausible but emotionally hollow, the kind of defense that addressed surface details while ignoring underlying patterns of behavior. Emma was demonstrating in real-time, the same capacity for rewriting reality that had characterized her response to my illness. She could transform abandonment into protection, absence into presence, manipulation into care, all while maintaining apparent sincerity. But what struck me most about her responses was their complete lack of curiosity about my experience. She never asked how her absence had affected me, never expressed interest in understanding why I felt abandoned, never demonstrated concern about the emotional impact of navigating cancer largely alone. Her focus remained entirely on defending her own actions and maintaining her own narrative. When I pointed this out, Emma's facade finally cracked. "I don't understand what you want from me," she said, her voice rising with frustration. "I did the best I could under impossible circumstances. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. I can't drop everything every time you need something." The statement was revealing in its honesty. Emma had finally admitted what I had suspected for months, that my cancer had been an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crisis requiring genuine response. In her hierarchy of priorities, my health emergency had ranked below work obligations, social commitments, and routine family activities. "You're right," I said quietly. "You can't drop everything for me. And I can't continue pretending that our relationship is something other than what it actually is." The words hung in the air between us, carrying weight that both of us understood. This wasn't an argument about missed appointments or inadequate support. It was an acknowledgement that our fundamental values and priorities were incompatible in ways that couldn't be bridged by good intentions or family obligation. Emma's next question revealed how little she understood about consequences and accountability. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, as if our relationship could continue unchanged despite the revelations of the past year. I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder containing documents I had been preparing for this moment. Inside were copies of correspondence with Patricia Williams, photographs of my studio and recent artwork, and letters from people who had provided genuine support during my treatment. The folder represented evidence of a life rebuilt according to principles of authenticity and reciprocity. "It means that my estate planning reflects my actual relationships rather than my hopeful fantasies," I said, handing her a copy of a letter Patricia had prepared explaining the changes to my will. "It means that people who were present during my crisis will benefit from my life's work, while people who were absent will receive exactly what they gave, nothing of substance." Emma read the letter in silence, her face moving through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. The document explained that her inheritance had been reduced to a token amount while the bulk of my estate would be distributed to organizations and individuals who had demonstrated genuine care during my illness. "You can't be serious," she said when she finished reading. "You're going to punish me for having a life outside of your medical problems? You're going to reward strangers instead of your own daughter?" Her response confirmed everything I had learned about her character during my illness. Even confronted with clear evidence of her absence and manipulation, Emma could only see the situation through the lens of what she was losing rather than what she had failed to provide. The idea that inheritance might be connected to relationship investment rather than biological connection seemed genuinely incomprehensible to her. "I'm not punishing you," I replied. "I'm acknowledging reality. Carol, my private nurse, spent more time caring for me during 1 week than you spent during 6 months of treatment. Eleanor, my neighbor, provided more emotional support than you offered during my entire cancer journey. The art therapy group created more space for my healing than our family ever did." I pulled out additional documents showing the specific allocations in my revised will. Carol's nursing agency would receive funding to provide free care for cancer patients without family support. The art therapy program would be endowed to serve more survivors. Eleanor would receive enough money to ensure her own comfort and security in her final years. Each bequest represented a relationship characterized by genuine presence and care. "These aren't strangers," I continued. "These are people who showed me what love actually looks like when it's expressed through action rather than words. You taught me the difference between being needed and being valued, between performing care and providing it." Emma's anger shifted to desperation as the full implications of the document became clear. She began making promises about changing her behavior, being more available, prioritizing family over work. But her promises felt hollow because they focused on future behavior rather than acknowledging past harm. She was still trying to manage the consequences of her choices rather than understanding why those choices had damaged our relationship. When she realized that her promises weren't changing my resolve, Emma played her final card, emotional manipulation designed to make me feel guilty for protecting my own interests. She spoke about the twins losing their grandmother's inheritance, about her husband's financial stress, about the unfairness of being judged so harshly for trying to balance multiple responsibilities. But the woman listening to these appeals was no longer the person who had spent decades prioritizing other people's comfort over her own needs. I had learned through cancer treatment what it meant to be truly alone, and I had discovered that solitude with dignity was preferable to connection without authenticity. Emma, I said when she finished her appeals, you have spent our entire relationship training me not to expect anything from you. You've taught me that your presence is conditional, that your care is performative, that your love is measured by convenience rather than commitment. The lesson has been thorough and effective. She stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language, unable to process the idea that her actions might have consequences beyond her immediate control. The concept that relationships required ongoing investment rather than one-time biological connection seemed to challenge her most basic assumptions about family obligations. You're my mother, she said finally, as if that title alone should be sufficient to ensure her inheritance regardless of our actual relationship quality. Yes, I agreed. And you're my daughter. Neither of those facts changes the reality of how you chose to treat me when I needed you most. Biology creates opportunity for relationship, not entitlement to its benefits. The conversation continued for another hour, but its essential dynamic never changed. Emma remained focused on what she stood to lose financially rather than what she had failed to provide emotionally. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the idea that inheritance might be connected to relationship investment, that love needed to be demonstrated through presence rather than promises. When she finally left that afternoon, Emma was still arguing about the unfairness of consequences that matched choices. She promised to contest the will, to prove that I was mentally incompetent, to rally other family members against my decision. But her threats felt empty because they were based on the same entitlement thinking that had characterized her behavior throughout my illness. That evening, I called Patricia Williams to schedule a final review of my estate documents. I wanted to ensure that everything was properly documented and that my reasoning was clearly explained for future reference. Patricia had been working on additional provisions that would make the will more difficult to contest, including psychological evaluations that demonstrated my mental competency and detailed explanations of my reasoning for each bequest. Are you comfortable with your decision? Patricia asked during our call. Once Emma realizes that her threats won't change anything, she may try different approaches to pressure you into reconsidering. I looked around my studio, filled with evidence of the life I had built according to my own values and priorities. The paintings on the walls represented not just artistic expression but emotional transformation, the journey from invisible caregiver to visible artist. The space itself embodied my commitment to authenticity over performance, genuine connection over obligated relationship. I'm completely comfortable, I told Patricia. This will reflect the relationships that actually sustained me rather than the ones I wished I had. Emma had years to choose a different kind of connection with me. The fact that she's only interested in changing now, when financial consequences are involved, proves that my assessment of her priorities was accurate. The weeks following my confrontation with Emma were surprisingly peaceful. She called several times, alternating between anger and pleading, but her communications felt like background noise rather than genuine attempts at reconciliation. She was focused on changing my mind rather than examining her own behavior, proving that even faced with clear consequences, she remained incapable of authentic self-reflection. Michael and David both called after Emma contacted them about the will changes. Their reactions were markedly different from hers. Both expressed regret about not being more present during my treatment and curiosity about my new life rather than anger about their own inheritance implications. When I explained my reasoning, they both said they understood and supported my decision. Mom, David said during one of our conversations, if Emma had been the daughter you needed during your cancer, she would be inheriting what you originally planned to leave her. The fact that she wasn't tells us everything we need to know about her priorities. Michael's response was even more direct. I'm proud of you for not letting her get away with claiming credit for care she didn't provide. What you went through was hard enough without having to pretend that your experience was different than it actually was. The support from my sons confirmed something important about the difference between authentic relationship and performed connection. Michael and David were capable of seeing the situation from my perspective rather than only focusing on their own interests. They understood that love needed to be demonstrated through actions rather than assumed based on biological connection. As autumn arrived and the anniversary of my diagnosis passed, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that cancer had brought into my life. The disease that had threatened to kill me had actually revealed truths that might have remained hidden for decades. Emma's abandonment during my treatment had forced me to discover my own capacity for independence and self-advocacy. More importantly, the experience had taught me to value relationships based on their actual content rather than their potential or my hopes for what they might become. The people who surrounded me now were there by choice rather than obligation, creating a community based on mutual care rather than one-sided giving. The art show opening in October was attended by my new chosen family, members of my art therapy group, friends from community college classes, Carol and her husband, Eleanor, and her adult children, Michael and David with their families. Emma was conspicuously absent, though she sent a text claiming work obligations prevented her attendance. Standing in the gallery beside my paintings, explaining my artistic journey to friends and strangers alike, I felt complete in a way I had never experienced while defining myself primarily as a mother and caregiver. The woman who had spent decades making herself invisible to accommodate other people's needs had become someone comfortable being seen and celebrated. The paintings themselves told the story of transformation more eloquently than words could convey. The early pieces, created during treatment, were dark and chaotic, full of fear and confusion. The middle works showed gradual emergence into light, tentative experiments with color and hope. The most recent paintings blazed with confidence and joy, evidence of someone who had learned to value her own perspective and experiences. When people asked about the inspiration for my work, I told them honestly about cancer, recovery, and the relationships that had sustained me through both. I spoke about the difference between being needed and being valued, between performing care and providing it, between biological connection and authentic relationship. Some listeners seemed uncomfortable with my directness, but most responded with recognition and appreciation for truth-telling. The evening was everything Emma's fictional narratives had never been: genuine, celebratory, focused on actual achievements rather than imagined sacrifices. The people present were there because they valued my company and wanted to support my artistic expression, not because they felt obligated to perform family duty. Late that night, alone in my studio, I opened the leather journal I had kept throughout my cancer journey and wrote what I knew would be my final entry. The words came easily, flowing from a place of hard-won wisdom and peaceful resolution. I began this journey believing that love meant endless availability, that being a good mother required sacrificing my own needs for my children's comfort. Cancer taught me that love without reciprocity is just exploitation, that presence matters more than promises, that authentic relationships require investment from both parties. I wrote about Emma's choice to harvest sympathy for fictional sacrifices while leaving me to navigate crisis alone. I documented her inability to see consequences as anything other than punishment, her focus on inheritance entitlement rather than relationship investment. But I also wrote about forgiveness, not the kind that excused behavior but the kind that released me from carrying other people's failures as my own burden. Most importantly, I wrote about discovery, learning that I was worthy of genuine care, that my presence was valuable, that my perspective mattered. Cancer had stripped away illusions about relationships that weren't serving me and revealed truths about my own strength and resilience. The woman who closed that journal was fundamentally different from the one who had opened it a year earlier. She was someone who understood her own worth, someone who insisted on authenticity in relationships, someone who had learned the difference between being needed and being valued. Emma would receive exactly what she had given during my darkest hours, a token acknowledgement of biological connection without any real substance or value. The people who had shown me genuine care would benefit from the life I had built through decades of careful saving and conservative values. The will sitting in Patricia Williams' office wasn't an act of revenge, it was a recognition of reality. It reflected actual relationships rather than hopeful fantasies, demonstrated values rather than assumed obligations. When I was gone, the distribution of my estate would tell the true story of my final years: who had been present when presence mattered, who had provided care when care was needed, who had valued Lucy Parker as a person rather than just a role. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I had never experienced before: complete peace with my choices and their consequences. I had spent 72 years learning what love actually looked like when it was authentic rather than performed, mutual rather than one-sided, chosen rather than obligated. Emma could continue constructing fictional narratives about our relationship, but those stories would no longer have any impact on my reality or my resources. The woman she had abandoned during cancer treatment had emerged stronger, clearer, and surrounded by people who understood that love was a verb rather than just a sentiment. The cancer that had threatened to end my story had actually begun the most authentic chapter of my life. And that chapter would continue, rich with genuine connection and purposeful choices, until its natural conclusion. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.